Crimson Moon Rising. Washington, D.C., 1920. Caroline Mitchell threw a letter belonging to Major Thomas Ellison into the fire, only to find it mysteriously intact the next morning with a new line, "Your destiny awaits." Chapter 1. Ashes and Whispers. The hearth was cold now, the embers having long since faded to a dull, lifeless gray. Caroline Mitchell knelt before it, her fingers tracing the intricate floral pattern of the tiles that framed the fireplace. Her drawing room, usually a sanctuary of warmth and meticulously curated elegance, felt chillingly empty this morning. The scent of lilies, her favorite, did little to mask the lingering, acrid memory of burnt paper. She reached into the cold ashes, her fingers brushing against something surprisingly smooth and intact. It couldn't be. She had watched it burn, the flames licking at the edges of the thick cream paper, the ink curling and blackening before the whole thing had supposedly dissolved into nothingness. Yet here it was. The letter. Major Thomas Ellison's letter. Caroline pulled it out, her hand trembling slightly. The paper was pristine, unmarked, as if it had never been near a flame. The elegant script, penned in a bold, confident hand, was just as she remembered it. "My dearest Caroline," it began, the words a painful echo of a past she was desperately trying to erase. A past that refused to stay buried. A past filled with the ghosts of war, whispered promises, and a love that had bloomed amidst the carnage of the Argonne forest. She had met Thomas during the war, while serving as a volunteer nurse at a Red Cross hospital in Washington, D.C. He had been recovering from a shrapnel wound, his body bearing the marks of battle, his eyes reflecting a weariness that went far beyond physical pain. He had been charming, despite his injuries, a glimmer of humor still flickering in his eyes. He had been everything her fiancé, Arthur, was not. Arthur, the steady, reliable banker, the epitome of Washington society, the man her parents had practically hand-picked for her. The letter had arrived yesterday, delivered by a young boy who had simply thrust it into her hands and disappeared before she could question him. It had been a foolish risk, writing to her. Arthur was a powerful man, with connections everywhere. A discovered correspondence with a former lover would be disastrous. For both of them. So, she had burned it. Or so she thought. Now, as she stared at the miraculously intact letter, a shiver ran down her spine. It was more than just surprise, it was a creeping sense of unease, a feeling that she was being watched, manipulated by forces she couldn't comprehend. And then she saw it. A new line, penned beneath Thomas's original closing, in the same familiar handwriting. "Your destiny awaits." The words were a chilling whisper, a promise, and a threat all rolled into one. Her destiny? What destiny? To be forever trapped in a gilded cage of her parents' making? To live a life of quiet desperation, married to a man she respected but did not love? The war had changed her, stripped away the superficiality of her former life, revealing a yearning for something more, something real. Thomas had shown her that something, however briefly, however dangerously. Caroline rose, clutching the letter to her chest. The silk of her morning gown rustled softly in the silence. The room was filled with the pale, watery light of a late autumn morning, the sky outside a canvas of muted grays. She walked to the window, her reflection staring back at her, a woman of 30, her dark hair meticulously styled, her features refined, her eyes haunted. The war had aged her, not in years, but in experience. She had seen too much death, too much suffering, to ever truly return to the carefree debutante she had once been. She looked down at the street below, the familiar bustle of Washington, D.C. life unfolding. Carriages rattled past, their wheels splashing through puddles left by the previous night's rain. People hurried along the sidewalks, their faces etched with the anxieties of a world still reeling from the aftermath of the Great War. The war to end all wars, they had called it, but the scars remained, visible and invisible, etched onto the souls of a generation. And now this letter, a ghost from her past, resurrected from the ashes, bearing a cryptic message. What did it mean? Was it a genuine message from Thomas? Or something else? A trick? A cruel joke? She had heard whispers of strange occurrences since the war ended, tales of soldiers returning with uncanny abilities, of unexplained phenomena, of a world subtly altered by the horrors it had endured. She thought of Thomas, of his strong hands, calloused from holding a rifle, yet gentle when they had touched her. She remembered the scent of him, a mixture of gunpowder, antiseptic, and something uniquely his own. She remembered the stolen moments, the whispered conversations in the dimly lit hospital ward, the desperate kisses exchanged under the cloak of darkness, the fear of discovery a constant, throbbing undercurrent to their passion. She had ended it, of course. It had been too dangerous, too reckless. She had written him a final letter, explaining her decision, pleading with him to understand. He had never replied. She had assumed he had accepted her choice, moved on. But now the grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour, its sonorous tones echoing through the silent house. 8 o'clock. Arthur would be arriving soon for their weekly Sunday brunch. He was always punctual, always predictable, a comforting anchor in the turbulent sea of her life. But today, the thought of his arrival filled her with a sense of dread. She couldn't face him, not with this letter burning a hole in her pocket, not with the ghost of Thomas Ellison suddenly resurrected in her life. She had to find out the truth. She had to know if this was a message from him, a desperate plea for help, or something far more sinister. She had to understand why the letter had refused to burn. And she had to do it all without Arthur or anyone else knowing. Caroline folded the letter carefully, her fingers lingering on the strange, new line. Your destiny awaits. The words echoed in her mind, a siren song calling her towards an unknown future, a future that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. She slipped the letter into a small, hidden pocket in her gown, the paper cool against her skin. She had a feeling this was just the beginning of a journey into the heart of a mystery, a journey that could very well shatter the carefully constructed facade of her life. And a small part of her was wondering if this wasn't some form of divine intervention, or a cruel twist of fate. She just couldn't quite decipher which. Chapter 2. The Major Shadow. The clinking of silverware against china, the polite murmur of conversation, the sounds of a typical Sunday brunch at the Mitchell residence were a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within Caroline. Arthur sat across from her, impeccably dressed as always, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes placid and untroubled. He was discussing the latest developments in the banking world, his words a steady, monotonous drone that usually soothed her. Today, they grated on her nerves. And the stabilization of the German mark is proving to be more challenging than anticipated, Arthur was saying, meticulously buttering a piece of toast. The reparations are, of course, a significant factor. Caroline forced a smile, trying to appear engaged. Of course, dear. It all sounds very complex. Arthur nodded, oblivious to her inner turmoil. Indeed. But we must maintain a firm hand. The war has left the world in a precarious state, and it is up to nations like ours to restore order. Order. The word hung in the air, heavy with irony. Caroline's own life was anything but orderly at the moment. The unburned letter felt like a lead weight in her pocket, a constant reminder of the chaos that threatened to engulf her. She glanced around the dining room, her gaze lingering on the familiar objects, the antique sideboard, the oil paintings depicting serene landscapes, the crystal chandelier that sparkled in the sunlight. Everything was in its place, perfectly arranged, reflecting the meticulous control that Arthur and her parents exerted over their lives. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to appear. Her parents, thankfully, were absent this morning, attending a charity event. Their absence was a small blessing, sparing her from their usual scrutiny and thinly veiled inquiries about her marital contentment. They had never approved of her involvement with the Red Cross during the war, deeming it unseemly for a woman of her station. They had been even less thrilled about her brief, intense relationship with Major Thomas Ellison. A soldier, they had sniffed, was hardly a suitable match for their daughter. Caroline took a sip of her tea, the delicate floral aroma doing little to calm her racing heart. She needed to find out more about Thomas, about his whereabouts, about the circumstances surrounding the letter.
But how?
She couldn't simply ask Arthur, or anyone in her social circle. The risk of exposure was too great. After brunch, Arthur excused himself to attend a meeting at his club. Caroline watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. She loved Arthur in a way. He was kind, dependable, and he genuinely cared for her. But it was a love born of comfort and familiarity, not of passion and fire. The kind of love she had briefly tasted with Thomas. Once she was alone, Caroline retreated to her study, a small, book-lined room that served as her personal sanctuary. She locked the door, then carefully retrieved the letter from her pocket. She read it again, her eyes lingering on the final, enigmatic line, "Your destiny awaits." She needed a plan. She needed to find someone who could help her, someone who knew Thomas, someone who understood the strange, unsettling world that had emerged in the wake of the war. Someone discreet, someone she could trust. The name came to her suddenly, a flicker of memory from her days at the Red Cross Hospital. Dr. Alistair Finch. He had been the head physician at the hospital, a brilliant but eccentric man with a reputation for unconventional methods and a keen interest in the psychological effects of war. He had also been a close friend of Thomas, often engaging in long, animated conversations with him during his recovery. Dr. Finch had left the hospital shortly after the war ended, rumored to be conducting private research into shell shock and other war-related traumas. He was known to be discreet, fiercely independent, and deeply loyal to his friends. He might be her only hope. Finding him, however, wouldn't be easy. He had always been a private man, and his current whereabouts were unknown. Caroline spent the rest of the afternoon searching through her old address books, diaries, and letters, hoping to find a clue, a contact, anything that could lead her to him. The light outside began to fade, casting long shadows across the room. The silence of the house pressed in on her, amplifying the sense of urgency and unease. She felt like she was walking a tightrope. One wrong step could send her tumbling into the abyss. Finally, in a dusty old box filled with wartime mementos, she found it. A small, worn card with Dr. Finch's name and a former address in Georgetown. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. Caroline carefully placed the card in her purse, along with the unburned letter. She would go to Georgetown tomorrow first thing. She would find Dr. Finch, and she would unravel the mystery of the letter, no matter the cost. As she prepared for bed, images of Thomas filled her mind. Strong, with a disarming smile, and eyes that told a story of resilience. She had to do this, not just to uncover the truth, but because a part of her, the part that yearned for more than a life, refused to let him go. She looked out at the rain that had begun to fall, the sound mirroring the persistent unease that filled her. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Argonne. The Georgetown address proved to be a narrow, 3-story townhouse tucked away on a quiet, tree-lined street. The paint was peeling, the shutters were slightly askew, and a general air of neglect hung about the place, a stark contrast to the polished elegance of Caroline's own neighborhood. It seemed an unlikely residence for a respected physician, even one as eccentric as Dr. Finch. Caroline hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the tarnished brass door knocker. Doubts gnawed at her. Was she chasing a phantom? Was Dr. Finch even still alive? And if he was, would he even remember her, let alone be willing to help? Taking a deep breath, she lifted the knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed hollowly within the house. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, she heard the shuffling of footsteps, followed by the creak of a heavy door opening. A woman stood before her, her face etched with suspicion. She was elderly, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a tightly drawn mouth. She wore a simple, dark dress and a white apron, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Yes," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "I'm looking for Dr. Alistair Finch," Caroline said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I believe he used to live here." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My name is Caroline Mitchell." I knew Dr. Finch during the war. I worked at the Red Cross hospital. A flicker of recognition crossed the woman's face. The hospital, yes. The doctor spoke of it often. She paused, studying Caroline intently. He's not here. He's away. Caroline's heart sank. Away? Do you know where he is? When he'll be back? The woman hesitated, her gaze shifting towards the interior of the house. I'm not at liberty to say. He left strict instructions, please. Caroline interrupted, her voice laced with desperation. It's very important. I need to speak with him urgently. The woman seemed to waver, her stern facade softening slightly. It's about the war, isn't it? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. About him? Caroline nodded, her eyes meeting the woman's gaze. Yes. It's about Major Ellison. And a letter. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm Mrs. Davies, the doctor's housekeeper. He may not be here, but perhaps I can help. Caroline followed Mrs. Davies into the house. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and old books. The walls were lined with overflowing bookshelves, and antique furniture cluttered the rooms. It felt like stepping back in time, into a world far removed from the modern bustle of Washington, D.C. Mrs. Davies led her to a small, cluttered study at the back of the house. The room was dominated by a large, mahogany desk piled high with papers, books, and scientific instruments. A single oil lamp cast a flickering glow over the scene, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Please sit down, Mrs. Davies said, gesturing towards a worn leather armchair. Caroline sat, her gaze taking in the details of the room. It was clearly Dr. Finch's workspace, a reflection of his brilliant, chaotic mind. She noticed a framed photograph on the desk, partially obscured by a stack of papers. She leaned forward, trying to get a better look. It was a picture of Dr. Finch and Thomas, taken during the war. They were both in uniform, standing in front of a makeshift hospital tent, their faces grim but determined. Thomas looked younger, his eyes less haunted, but the familiar intensity was still there. He was a good man, Major Ellison, Mrs. Davies said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. The doctor cared for him deeply. I know, Caroline said, her voice choked with emotion. He saved my life. Mrs. Davies looked at her with surprise. Saved your life? Caroline nodded, her mind flooding with memories of the Argonne forest. The relentless shelling, the screams of the wounded, the mud and blood and chaos. She had been caught in a surprise attack, separated from her unit, pinned down by enemy fire. Thomas had found her, shielding her with his own body, dragging her to safety. He risked his life for me, Caroline said, her voice trembling. I owe him everything. Mrs. Davies nodded slowly. The doctor said he was a hero, a true soldier. She paused, her gaze fixed on the photograph. He disappeared, after the war. Vanished without a trace. Caroline's heart skipped a beat. Disappeared? What do you mean? No one knows what happened to him. He sent a few letters from France, then nothing. The doctor tried to find him, but it was like he vanished into thin air. Caroline felt a cold dread creeping over her. The unburned letter, the cryptic message, it all pointed to something far more complex, far more dangerous than she had initially imagined. Mrs. Davies, she said, her voice urgent. This letter, I need to show it to you. She reached into her purse and pulled out the letter, carefully unfolding it. Mrs. Davies took it, her hands trembling slightly. She held it up to the lamplight, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It's his, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. But how? It's been years. She reached the end of the letter, her eyes widening as she read the final, added line. Your destiny awaits. This wasn't here before, she said, her voice shaking. I know it. I read every letter he sent. This is new. Caroline leaned forward, her heart pounding. What does it mean, Mrs. Davies? Do you have any idea? Mrs. Davies shook her head, her face pale. I don't know, but I know the doctor was working on something. Something secret. Something to do with the war, with the unexplained. She reached into a drawer in the desk and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. This was his. He kept it locked away. I haven't dared to open it, but perhaps it holds the answers you seek. Caroline took the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather. It felt heavy in her hands, filled with the weight of untold secrets. She knew, in that moment, that she was stepping into a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. A world of hidden truths, of wartime conspiracies, and of a love that had refused to die, even in the face of death. She looked up at the portrait and knew that this might lead her to a truth far worse than she could handle. Chapter 4. The Society of Secrets. The journal was a window into Dr. Finch's mind, a chaotic jumble of scientific observations, philosophical musings, and cryptic notes that hinted at a hidden world operating beneath the surface of post-war society. Caroline spent hours poring over the entries, deciphering the doctor's sprawling handwriting, trying to make sense of the fragmented information. Many of the entries focused on the psychological effects of the war, detailing case studies of soldiers suffering from shell shock, now known as PTSD. Dr. Finch's observations were insightful and compassionate, revealing a deep understanding of the trauma that these men had endured. But interspersed with these clinical notes were more unsettling entries, references to unexplained phenomena, altered states of consciousness, and a mysterious organization referred to only as the Kronos Society. Caroline's initial skepticism began to waver as she delved deeper into the journal. Dr. Finch's meticulous observations, his scientific rigor, lent credibility to even the most outlandish claims. He documented cases of soldiers exhibiting strange abilities: telepathy, precognition, even the ability to manipulate objects with their minds. He theorized that the intense stress and trauma of the war had somehow unlocked latent potential within the human brain, creating a new breed of individuals with extraordinary powers. And then there were the entries about Thomas. Dr. Finch had clearly been fascinated by Thomas, documenting his remarkable resilience, his unwavering courage, and his unusual sensitivity. He noted that Thomas had experienced vivid dreams and premonitions during the war, often accurately predicting enemy attacks or identifying hidden dangers. He also described Thomas's uncanny ability to heal quickly from injuries, a phenomenon that defied medical explanation. One entry, in particular, sent a chill down Caroline's spine. Major Ellison reports another vivid dream. He saw a burning letter, a message from a woman he loves. He believes it is a warning, a sign of danger. He speaks of a destiny that awaits him, a path he must follow, no matter the cost. I am beginning to suspect that he is more than just a soldier. He is a key, a conduit to something greater. Caroline closed the journal, her hands trembling. The burning letter, Thomas had seen it in a dream before it had even happened. It was as if he was reaching out to her, across time and space, guiding her, warning her. But warning her of what? The Kronos Society. The name kept recurring throughout the journal, always shrouded in mystery. Dr. Finch seemed to believe that this organization was somehow connected to the unexplained phenomena he was investigating, that they were actively seeking out individuals with extraordinary abilities, recruiting them for their own unknown purposes. One passage, heavily underlined and circled, caught Caroline's attention. The Kronos Society is ancient, its roots stretching back centuries. They believe that time is not linear, that it can be manipulated, even controlled. They seek to harness the power of those who have been touched by the war, to reshape the future according to their own design. They are dangerous, ruthless, and they will stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Caroline felt a growing sense of dread. Was Thomas involved with the society? Was he a victim or a willing participant? The thought that he might be in danger, that he might be manipulated by some shadowy organization, filled her with a renewed sense of urgency. She had to find out more. She had to uncover the truth about the Kronos Society and about Thomas's disappearance. But where to begin? The journal offered few concrete clues, only fragmented references and cryptic hints. Dr. Finch had clearly been cautious, aware that his research was dangerous, that he was treading on forbidden ground. Caroline decided to return to Dr. Finch's study, hoping to find something, anything, that could shed more light on the Kronos Society. She searched through the drawers, the bookshelves, the piles of papers, her fingers brushing against dusty artifacts and forgotten mementos. And then she found it. Hidden beneath a stack of medical journals, she discovered a small, wooden box. It was locked, but the key was still in the lock. Caroline hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she was crossing a line, intruding on Dr. Finch's private world. But she had to know. She turned the key, the lock clicking open with a soft snap. She lifted the lid, her breath catching in her throat. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single object, a silver locket, intricately engraved with a strange, unfamiliar symbol. A symbol that she had seen before in Dr. Finch's journal. The symbol of the Chronos Society. As she picked it up and turned to leave, a noise from the doorway alerted her. Arthur. How long had he been standing there? Chapter 5. A Dance with Deception. Arthur stood in the doorway, his usually placid expression replaced with a mixture of confusion and concern. He looked from Caroline, clutching the locket, to the open box and the scattered contents of Dr. Finch's study. The air crackled with unspoken questions. Caroline, he said, his voice carefully controlled. What is going on here? Who is Dr. Finch? And why are you going through his things? Caroline's mind raced. She couldn't tell him the truth, not all of it. He wouldn't understand. He would dismiss it as fanciful nonsense, the product of an overactive imagination. Or worse, he would become suspicious, controlling, potentially revealing her search to those who should not know. She forced a smile, trying to appear calm and unconcerned. Arthur, darling, you startled me. I was just looking for something. Looking for what? He pressed, his eyes narrowed. And who is this Dr. Finch? He was a doctor I knew during the war, Caroline explained, choosing her words carefully. He treated a friend of mine. I was hoping to find some information about him. A friend? Arthur's voice held a hint of suspicion. What friend? Caroline hesitated. She couldn't mention Thomas, not yet. Just a fellow volunteer. We lost touch after the war, and I was hoping to reconnect. Arthur stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the cluttered desk, the overflowing bookshelves. This place, it doesn't look like a doctor's office. It looks more like a shrine to something. He was a bit eccentric, Caroline admitted, trying to sound casual. He had unconventional interests. Arthur picked up a book from the desk, its title written in a strange, unfamiliar language. What is this? I don't know, Caroline stammered. He was interested in ancient history, mythology. Arthur's eyes fell on the open box and the silver locket in Caroline's hand. And that? What is that? Caroline quickly slipped the locket into her pocket, her heart pounding. It's just a trinket. Nothing important. Arthur didn't look convinced. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. Caroline, he said, his voice softer now, you seem different. Distracted. Is something troubling you? Caroline felt a pang of guilt. She hated lying to him, but she saw no other choice. She had to protect him, protect herself, from the dangerous secrets she was uncovering. I'm fine, Arthur, she said, forcing a smile. Just a bit tired. It's been a long day. Arthur didn't press her further, but the suspicion in his eyes lingered. He helped her gather the scattered items, his touch gentle but firm. As they left the study, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that her every move was being scrutinized. The drive back to their home was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Arthur made polite conversation, but his usual warmth was absent. Caroline tried to respond, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene in the study, wondering if she had aroused Arthur's suspicions beyond repair. Once they were back in their familiar surroundings, Caroline excused herself, claiming a headache. She retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She needed time to think, to plan her next move. She took the locket out of her pocket, examining it closely. The strange symbol, a circle intertwined with a serpent, seemed to pulse with a faint energy. She had seen it before in Dr. Finch's journal, but she still didn't know its meaning. She needed to find someone who could decipher the symbol, someone who understood the esoteric world that Dr. Finch had inhabited. Someone who could help her unravel the mystery of the Kronos Society. She thought of Mrs. Davies, the doctor's loyal housekeeper. She seemed to know more than she was letting on. Perhaps she could be persuaded to reveal more, to provide a clue, a contact. But contacting Mrs. Davies again would be risky, especially with Arthur's suspicions aroused. She needed to be careful, to move discreetly. Caroline decided to write a letter to Mrs. Davies, arranging a discreet meeting, a place where they could talk without fear of being overheard. She would use a pseudonym, a code name, to protect her identity. She chose the name Sparrow, a reference to the small, agile birds that had often flitted around the hospital tents during the war. It felt appropriate, a symbol of freedom and resilience. She penned the letter carefully, choosing her words with precision. She would meet Mrs. Davies at the National Gallery of Art, in front of a specific painting, at a specific time. It was a public place, yet it offered a degree of privacy, a chance to blend in with the crowds. As she sealed the letter, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing a dangerous game, a dance with deception where one wrong step could have devastating consequences. But she had to continue. She had to find Thomas, and she had to uncover the truth about the Kronos Society, no matter the cost. She owed it to Thomas, and she owed it to herself, a Caroline he had helped create. Chapter 6. The Unspoken Vow. The National Gallery of Art buzzed with the quiet murmur of visitors admiring the masterpieces that adorned its walls. Caroline, dressed in a simple, unassuming gray dress and a wide-brimmed hat that partially concealed her face, blended seamlessly into the crowd. She had chosen a painting of a dramatic seascape, its turbulent waves and stormy sky mirroring the turmoil within her. She arrived early, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She scanned the faces around her, searching for Mrs. Davies, her hand clutching the small, silver locket in her pocket. The air was thick with a scent of oil paint and beeswax, a familiar, comforting aroma that did little to calm her racing nerves. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Doubts began to creep into her mind. Had Mrs. Davies received her letter? Had she decided not to come? Or worse, had she alerted someone else, perhaps even Arthur? Just as she was about to give up hope, she saw her. Mrs. Davies, standing a short distance away, her gaze fixed on the painting. She looked older, more frail than Caroline remembered, her face etched with worry. Caroline took a deep breath and approached her, her steps measured and deliberate. "Mrs. Davies?" she said softly, using her chosen code name. "Sparrow?" Mrs. Davies turned, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. "Mrs. Mitchell, you came." "I had to," Caroline said, her voice low and urgent. "I need your help." They moved to a quieter corner of the gallery, away from the prying eyes of other visitors. Caroline quickly explained her encounter with Arthur, her growing suspicions about the Kronos Society, and her desperate need to find Thomas. Mrs. Davies listened intently, her face growing increasingly pale. "I feared this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The doctor warned me, he said they were dangerous." "Who are they, Mrs. Davies?" Caroline pressed. "What do they want?" Mrs. Davies hesitated, her gaze darting around the room. They are collectors," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Collectors of talents. Of people with abilities." "Abilities?" Caroline repeated, her mind racing back to Dr. Finch's journal, to his descriptions of soldiers exhibiting strange powers. "Yes," Mrs. Davies confirmed. "The war had changed some people. It unlocked something within them. The Kronos Society, they seek these people out. They want to control them, to use them for their own purposes." Caroline felt a chill run down her spine. "And Thomas, was he one of them?" Mrs. Davies nodded slowly. The doctor believed so. He said Thomas was special. He had a gift, a power that the Kronos Society coveted. "But what power?" Caroline asked, her voice filled with desperation. "What did they want from him?" Mrs. Davies looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. "The power to see the future," she whispered. "To alter time." Caroline's breath caught in her throat. It was even more incredible, more dangerous, than she had imagined. Thomas, a pawn in a game of temporal manipulation, a target for an organization that sought to control the very fabric of reality. "We have to find him," Caroline said, her voice firm with determination. "We have to save him." Mrs. Davies shook her head sadly. "It's too late. He's gone. They took him." "No," Caroline insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I don't believe it. He's still out there. I can feel it." She pulled out the silver locket, showing it to Mrs. Davies. This is their symbol, isn't it? The Kronos Society." Mrs. Davies nodded, her eyes widening in recognition. "Yes." "Where did you find it?" "In Dr. Finch's study," Caroline explained. "Hidden away. I think it might be a key. A key to finding them, to finding Thomas." Mrs. Davies took the locket, her fingers tracing the intricate engraving. "It's a temporal compass," she said, her voice filled with awe. "The doctor spoke of it, but I never thought it's a device that can detect temporal disturbances." "Rifts in time." "Rifts in time?" Caroline repeated, her mind struggling to grasp the concept. "Yes," Mrs. Davies confirmed. "The Kronos Society, they don't just see the future, they manipulate it. They create temporary anomalies, pockets of altered time. This locket, it can lead us to them." Caroline felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. "Then we have to use it," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to find these rifts, these anomalies. And we have to find Thomas." Before Mrs. Davies could reply, a man's voice cut through the air. "Looking for something, ladies?" Both women tensed, not knowing what to expect. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Ward. The man was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his features sharp and hawkish. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the two women with an unsettling intensity. He held a subtle, almost imperceptible air of authority, the kind that sent shivers down one's spine. "Can I help you?" Caroline asked, trying to keep her voice steady, her hand instinctively moving to cover the locket in her pocket. The man smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I believe I can help you," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. You seem to be interested in temporal matters." Mrs. Davies paled, her hand clutching Caroline's arm. We were just discussing art," she stammered, her voice trembling. The man chuckled softly. "Art? Indeed. The art of manipulating time, perhaps?" He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Caroline. "You have something that belongs to us, Mrs. Mitchell. Something valuable." Caroline's heart pounded in her chest. She knew, in that moment, that she was facing a member of the Kronos Society. A dangerous adversary, one who would stop at nothing to retrieve the locket. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to sound defiant, but her voice wavered slightly. The man's smile widened. "Don't play coy, Mrs. Mitchell. We know about the locket. We know about Dr. Finch's journal. And we know about your connection to Major Ellison." Caroline felt a chill run down her spine. They knew everything. They had been watching her, tracking her every move. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Do you know where he is?" The man's expression turned cold. "That is none of your concern. All that matters is the locket. Hand it over, and we might consider letting you live." Caroline's grip tightened on the locket. She wouldn't give it up, not without a fight. It was her only link to Thomas, her only hope of finding him. "I won't give it to you," she said, her voice firmer now, fueled by a surge of adrenaline. "Not until you tell me what you've done with him." The man sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Very well, Mrs. Mitchell. Have it your way." He nodded to someone behind Caroline, a figure she hadn't noticed before. A second man, burly and menacing, stepped forward, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Caroline knew, instinctively, that he was reaching for a weapon. "Mrs. Davies, run!" Caroline shouted, pushing the elderly woman towards the exit. Mrs. Davies hesitated for a moment, her eyes filled with fear, but then she obeyed, scrambling away as fast as her frail legs could carry her. Caroline turned to face her attackers, her heart pounding in her chest. She was trapped, cornered, with no way out. But she wouldn't surrender. She would fight for Thomas, for her own survival. The burly man lunged at her, his hand grabbing for the locket. Caroline dodged his grasp, narrowly avoiding his outstretched fingers. She kicked him hard in the shin, causing him to stumble backward. The first man, the one in the suit, watched the scene unfold with a detached amusement. "Such spirit, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But it's futile. You can't win." Caroline ignored him, focusing on her attacker. She had to find a way to escape, to get to safety. She scanned the room, her eyes searching for a weapon, a means of defense. She spotted a small, bronze statue on a nearby pedestal. It was heavy, solid, a potential weapon. She lunged for it, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal. The burly man recovered, charging at her again. Caroline swung the statue, hitting him squarely in the head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The man in the suit clapped his hands slowly. "Impressive, Mrs. Mitchell. Very impressive. But you're still outnumbered." Caroline turned to face him, the statue held high, her body trembling with adrenaline. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice defiant. The man smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "Perhaps you should be," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We have ways of making people cooperate." Before Caroline could react, he pulled a small, silver device from his pocket. It was similar to the locket, but smaller, more streamlined. He pressed a button, and a faint, humming sound filled the air. Caroline felt a sudden, sharp pain in her head, a searing wave of energy that threatened to overwhelm her senses. She staggered backward, clutching her head, the statue falling from her grasp. The room began to spin, the colors blurring, the sounds distorting. She felt like she was falling, tumbling into a dark, bottomless abyss. She saw Thomas's face before her. Chapter 8. The Price of Silence. Caroline awoke to the throbbing ache of a headache and the disorienting sensation of being restrained. Her wrists were bound tightly to a chair, the rough rope chafing against her skin. She was in a dimly lit room, the air thick with the scent of dust and damp earth. The only source of light was a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. She struggled against her bonds, but it was useless. The ropes were too tight, the knots too secure. She was trapped, a prisoner of the Kronos Society. The man in the suit, the one she had encountered at the gallery, entered the room, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. He smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent shivers down her spine. "Welcome, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "I trust you're comfortable?" Caroline glared at him, her eyes filled with defiance. "Where am I? What have you done with Thomas?" The man chuckled softly. "So many questions. So little time." He circled her slowly, like a predator toying with its prey. "You're in one of our facilities. A place where we conduct our research." "Research?" Caroline spat, her voice filled with disgust. "You mean torture. Kidnapping." The man's smile widened. "Such harsh words, Mrs. Mitchell. We prefer to think of it as persuasion. We have ways of making people cooperative." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket, the one Caroline had taken from Dr. Finch's study. He dangled it before her eyes, the strange symbol glinting in the dim light. This is what you want, isn't it?" Caroline said, her voice trembling slightly. "The temporal compass." The man nodded. "Indeed. A remarkable device. A key to unlocking the secrets of time." He paused, his gaze fixed on her. "But it's useless without the activation code. And you, Mrs. Mitchell, know that code." Caroline's heart sank. She had suspected as much. Dr. Finch had entrusted her with a journal, with a locket, knowing that she would be the key to unlocking its power. But she had no idea what the activation code was. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, trying to sound convincing. The man sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Don't waste my time, Mrs. Mitchell. We know about your connection to Dr. Finch. We know he shared his secrets with you. The code, it's in the journal, isn't it? Hidden somewhere within his cryptic notes." Caroline remained silent, her mind racing. She couldn't give them the code, not without knowing what they intended to do with it. But she also couldn't let them torture her, break her. The man stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "We have ways of extracting information, Mrs. Mitchell. Painful ways. I suggest you cooperate for your own sake." Caroline closed her eyes, trying to block out his menacing presence. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle smile, his unwavering courage. She had to be strong, for him. "I need time," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "The journal, it's complex. I need to decipher it." The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. "Very well, Mrs. Mitchell. I'll give you time, but not much. If you don't provide us with the code within 24 hours, we'll have to resort to more drastic measures." He turned and left the room, the heavy door clanging shut behind him. Caroline was left alone, in the darkness, her mind racing, her body aching. She had to find a way to escape, to get to the journal, to decipher the code before it was too late. But how? She was trapped, surrounded by enemies, with no hope of rescue. As the hours ticked by, Caroline's despair grew. She replayed the events of the past few days, her mind searching for a clue, a missed opportunity, anything that could help her. She thought of Mrs. Davies, the loyal housekeeper. Had she escaped? Had she alerted anyone? Or had she, too, fallen victim to the Chronos Society? She thought of Arthur, her husband.
He must be worried sick.
But she couldn't contact him, not without risking his life. The Chronos Society was watching her, listening to her every move. As the darkness deepened, Caroline felt a flicker of hope. She remembered a small, almost insignificant detail from Dr. Finch's journal. A reference to a hidden compartment, a secret compartment within the locket itself. She reached for the locket, still tucked away in her pocket. She'd managed to hide it before being captured. Her fingers fumbled with the intricate engraving, searching for a hidden seam, a release mechanism. It wasn't on her person. It was gone. And the realization of that loss sunk deep, like a cold, heavy stone. Chapter 9. Between Duty and Desire. Hours crawled by, each one an eternity. The silence of the room was broken only by the occasional drip of water and the frantic beating of Caroline's own heart. Despair threatened to engulf her, but she fought it back, clinging to the memory of Thomas, to the hope that she could still save him. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise, a scratching sound coming from the other side of the door. She held her breath, listening intently. Was it one of her captors? Or something else? The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. Then a small, metallic object slid under the door, landing with a soft clink on the stone floor. Caroline strained her eyes, trying to make out the object in the dim light. It was a small, silver key. A key that looked remarkably like the one that had unlocked Dr. Finch's hidden box. Hope surged through her, a jolt of adrenaline that banished her despair. Someone was helping her. But who?
And why?
She struggled against her bonds, trying to reach the key, but it was too far. She stretched her legs, her feet straining towards the object, but it was still out of reach. Then, she remembered the small, sharp hairpin she always kept tucked in her hair. She had managed to keep it hidden during her capture. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. With trembling fingers, she carefully removed the hairpin, her heart pounding in her chest. She bent it slightly, creating a small hook at the end. Then, using her feet, she carefully maneuvered the hairpin towards the key, her muscles straining with the effort. After what felt like an eternity, the hook caught on the key's ring. Caroline slowly, carefully, dragged the key towards her, her breath held tight in her chest. Finally, the key was within reach. She used her bound hands to grasp it, her fingers fumbling with the cold metal. She inserted the key into the lock of her wrist restraints, her heart pounding with anticipation. The lock clicked open. Caroline was free. She quickly unlocked the other restraint, her hands trembling with relief. She stood up, her legs shaky from hours of immobility. She had to escape, to get out of this place before her captors returned. She crept towards the door, her ears straining for any sound of movement. She carefully opened the door, peering out into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty. She slipped out of the room, her footsteps silent on the stone floor. She had no idea where she was going, but she had to find a way out, a way to contact help. As she moved through the labyrinthine corridors, she noticed small, almost imperceptible details. Strange symbols etched into the walls, flickering lights that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was clear that this place was more than just a prison. It was a center of the Chronos Society's operations, a place where they conducted their strange, temporal experiments. She came to a large, metal door, guarded by 2 armed men. She knew she couldn't fight her way past them. She needed a distraction, a way to slip past them unnoticed. She spotted a small, fire alarm box on the wall. It was a risky move, but it was her only chance. She took a deep breath, then smashed the glass, pulling the alarm lever. The alarm blared, its piercing sound echoing through the corridors. The guards looked startled, their attention momentarily diverted. Caroline seized the opportunity, slipping past them, disappearing into the shadows. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, her lungs burning with exertion. She had to find a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. As she rounded a corner, she saw him. Thomas. He was standing in the middle of a large, circular chamber, surrounded by strange, glowing machinery. He looked pale, weakened, but his eyes still held that familiar intensity, that unwavering courage. He saw her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Caroline?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Caroline ran towards him, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas, you're alive." They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. But their reunion was short-lived. The man in the suit, the one who had captured her, appeared in the doorway, his face contorted with rage. "So you escaped, Mrs. Mitchell. Impressive. But it's over." He raised his hand, the silver device glinting in the light. "I'm afraid I can't let you interfere with our plans." Thomas stepped in between them, his voice shaking. "Leave her alone." Chapter 10. The Serpent's Kiss. The man in the suit he had introduced himself earlier as Silas. Though Caroline doubted it was his real name, lowered his hand slightly, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Major Ellison. Always the hero. But your heroics are futile. You can't stop us." "What do you want?" Thomas asked, his voice strained, his body positioned protectively in front of Caroline. He looked thinner, wearier than she remembered, but his eyes still held that spark of defiance that had first drawn her to him. "We want what we've always wanted," Silas replied, his voice smooth and menacing.
"To control time.
To reshape the future. And you, Major, are the key." "I won't help you," Thomas said, his voice firm, despite the tremor in his hands. Silas chuckled softly. "You don't have a choice. We've already altered you. Enhanced your abilities. You're one of us now." Caroline felt a chill run down her spine. Altered him? What had they done to him? She looked at Thomas, searching for any sign of change, any hint of the manipulation Silas spoke of. "He's lying, Thomas," Caroline said, her voice urgent. "Don't listen to him." Thomas turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and confusion. "Caroline, I don't know what's happening to me. I see things, feel things I can't explain." Silas smiled, a predatory expression that made Caroline's skin crawl. "He's experiencing temporal shifts, Mrs. Mitchell. Glimpses of possible futures. He's becoming more than human." "You're a monster," Caroline spat, her voice filled with disgust. Silas ignored her, his gaze fixed on Thomas. "Embrace your destiny, Major. Join us. Help us create a new world order." Thomas hesitated, his body trembling. He looked from Silas to Caroline, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for help. Caroline knew she had to act, to break the hold that Silas had on him. She remembered the hairpin, still clutched in her hand. It was a small, insignificant weapon, but it was all she had. "Thomas, don't," she cried, stepping forward. "He's manipulating you. Remember who you are." Remember us. Her words seemed to reach him, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He straightened slightly, his eyes clearing. I remember, he whispered, his voice gaining strength. I remember the Argonne. I remember you. Silas's smile vanished, replaced by a look of fury. Enough of this sentimentality, he snarled. You will obey. He raised his hand again, the silver device glowing ominously. But before he could activate it, Caroline lunged forward, her hairpin aimed at his hand. She stabbed him, hard in the wrist, the sharp point piercing his skin. Silas cried out in pain, dropping the device. It clattered to the floor, skidding across the stone. Thomas reacted instantly, kicking the device away, sending it flying into the shadows. He then grabbed Silas, his hands wrapping around the man's throat. You won't hurt her, Thomas growled, his voice filled with a primal rage. You won't hurt anyone else. Silas struggled, his face turning red, his eyes bulging. But Thomas's grip was too strong. He had the strength of a desperate man, a man fighting for his love, for his freedom. Suddenly, the room began to shake, the lights flickering violently. The strange machinery surrounding them whirred and sparked, emitting a deafening roar. What's happening? Caroline cried, her voice barely audible above the din. The temporal rift, Thomas shouted, his eyes wide with alarm. It's destabilizing. Caroline realized what was happening. The Chronos Society's experiments, their manipulation of time, had created a dangerous instability. The very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The room began to dissolve, the walls and floor crumbling, the machinery exploding in showers of sparks. Caroline and Thomas clung to each other, their bodies trembling with fear. They were being pulled into the rift, sucked into a vortex of swirling colors and distorted shapes. It felt like falling, tumbling through an endless void, with no sense of up or down, past or future. Caroline closed her eyes, her mind filled with a single thought, Thomas. She held onto him tightly, her love for him a beacon in the chaos, a lifeline in the storm. And then everything went black. The last thing she saw was Thomas's face, contorted not in fear, but in fierce determination. He would save them. He had to. Chapter 11. A glimmer of hope. Caroline awoke to the sensation of warmth on her skin and the sound of birds chirping. She was lying on soft grass, her head resting on something or someone. She opened her eyes, blinking in the bright sunlight. She was in a field, a vast expanse of green stretching as far as the eye could see. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray, sterile environment of the Chronos Society's facility. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the scent of wildflowers and damp earth. She turned her head and saw Thomas. He was lying beside her, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling softly. He looked peaceful, his features relaxed, the lines of strain and worry erased from his face. She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of his face. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his lips. Caroline, he whispered, his voice hoarse, but filled with relief. You're all right. Where we're safe? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I think so, he said, sitting up, his gaze sweeping across the landscape. I don't know where we are, or when. Caroline sat up as well, her body aching from the ordeal. She looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. It was clearly not Washington, D.C. The landscape was too rural, too untouched by the modern world. The temporal rift, she said, her mind racing. It must have transported us.
But where?
And when? Thomas nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. It's possible. The Chronos Society was experimenting with time travel. They must have sent us somewhere. He stood up, extending his hand to help her to her feet. Caroline took it, her fingers interlacing with his. She felt a surge of warmth, a sense of connection that transcended their strange, uncertain circumstances. They began to walk, their steps slow and tentative, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of civilization. The The sun was high in the sky, indicating that it was midday. The air was warm, but a gentle breeze rustled through the grass, providing a welcome relief. As they walked, they talked, sharing their experiences, piecing together the events that had led them to this strange, unknown place. Thomas described the horrors of the Chronos Society's experiments, the forced temporal shifts, the attempts to control his mind. "They wanted to use me," he said, his voice filled with a quiet rage. "To weaponize my ability to see the future. To change history to their liking." Caroline shivered, imagining the implications of such power. "But you resisted them," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Thomas nodded. "I fought them. Every step of the way. I knew I couldn't let them win." They walked in silence for a while, their thoughts consumed by the enormity of their situation. They were stranded in an unknown time and place, with no idea how to get back. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field, they saw it. A small village, nestled in a valley, smoke rising from its chimneys, the faint sound of voices carrying on the breeze. Hope surged through Caroline, a renewed sense of determination. They were not alone. They had found civilization. Perhaps they could find help, a way to return to their own time. They approached the village cautiously, their hearts pounding with anticipation and anxiety. The buildings were old, constructed of wood and stone, their architecture unfamiliar. The people they saw were dressed in simple, homespun clothes, their faces weathered by the sun and wind. As they entered the village square, a group of villagers gathered around them, their eyes filled with curiosity and suspicion. An elderly man, his face etched with wisdom, stepped forward. "Welcome, strangers," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Who are you? And where do you come from?" Caroline and Thomas exchanged a glance. They knew they couldn't reveal the truth, not yet. They had to be careful, to gauge the situation before revealing their origins. We are travelers," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "We have lost our way." The elderly man studied them for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. "Lost your way, you say? Perhaps we can help you find it." He offered them shelter. Chapter 12. The Unveiling. The villagers, despite their initial suspicion, proved to be kind and generous. They offered Caroline and Thomas food, shelter, and clothing, treating them with a warmth and hospitality that belied their isolated existence. They learned that they were in a small, rural community in England, a place seemingly untouched by the ravages of the Great War. The year, they discovered with a mixture of shock and relief, was 1888. The elderly man who had greeted them, Elias Croft, was the village elder, a respected figure who held a position of authority and wisdom. He seemed to sense that Caroline and Thomas were hiding something, but he didn't press them, instead offering them a safe haven, a place to rest and recover. Caroline and Thomas settled into a small, cozy cottage on the outskirts of the village, their days filled with simple tasks, tending to the garden, helping with the harvest, learning the customs and traditions of this bygone era. They found a strange solace in the rhythm of rural life, a sense of peace that had eluded them in the turbulent world they had left behind. But the past and the future were never far from their minds. They knew they couldn't stay in 1888 forever. They had to find a way to return to their own time, to stop the Chronos Society, to prevent the catastrophic future that Silas had envisioned. They spent hours discussing their options, their conversations hushed and secretive, always mindful of the watchful eyes of the villagers. They knew they couldn't reveal the truth about their origins, not without risking disbelief, fear, or even persecution. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls, Caroline brought up the subject of the locket. "The temporal compass," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to find it. It's our only hope of getting back." Thomas nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "I know, but it was lost. Silas had it, then it fell during the chaos, into the rift." But what if Caroline hesitated, her mind racing? What if it traveled with us? What if it's somewhere here? Thomas looked at her, his eyes widening with a flicker of hope. "It's possible. The rift was unstable. It could have deposited it anywhere.
Or anywhen.
They decided to search for the locket, their efforts discreet and cautious, always careful not to arouse suspicion. They explored the surrounding countryside, the fields, the forests, the ancient ruins that dotted the landscape. Days turned into weeks, and still, they found nothing. Despair began to creep back in, threatening to extinguish their hope. One afternoon, while exploring a nearby forest, Caroline stumbled upon a hidden cave, its entrance concealed by a thick curtain of ivy. She felt a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to enter. She called out to Thomas, and together, they ventured into the darkness, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, the silence broken only by the dripping of water. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they saw it. A faint, shimmering glow emanating from a small crevice in the cave wall. They approached the crevice, their hands trembling. Caroline reached into the narrow opening, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. She pulled it out. It was the locket, the temporal compass. Intact, unharmed, its silver surface gleaming in the faint light. Relief washed over them, a wave of emotion that brought tears to their eyes. They had found it. Their hope was restored. But as Thomas reached out to take the locket, a voice echoed through the cave. Looking for this? They turned, their hearts sinking. Standing at the entrance of the cave, silhouetted against the daylight, was Silas. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes still held that same cold, calculating intensity. He had followed them, through time, and he smirked, the serpent ready to strike. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood villagers, their faces no longer welcoming. Chapter 13. Scars of the Past.
How?
Thomas stammered, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on Silas, the man who had haunted his nightmares. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the cave. Did you really think you could escape us, Major? Time is our domain. We have eyes everywhere. And everyone. Caroline felt a cold dread creeping over her. They were trapped, cornered, with no way out. The villagers, their former protectors, now stood behind Silas, their faces hardened, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. Elias, Caroline said, her voice pleading, turning to the village elder. He's not who you think he is. He's dangerous. Elias Croft stepped forward, his expression grim. We know who you are, he said, his voice filled with a quiet authority. Strangers. Outsiders. You brought this evil upon us. Evil? Thomas retorted, his voice rising in anger. He's the evil one. He's manipulating you, using you. Silas raised his hand, silencing Thomas. Enough of this charade, he said, his voice cold and commanding. The locket. Hand it over. Caroline clutched the locket tightly, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal. She wouldn't give it up, not without a fight. It was their only hope of returning to their own time, of stopping the Kronos Society's plans. We won't let you have it, she said, her voice defiant, despite the tremor in her hands. Silas smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. You have no choice, Mrs. Mitchell. We have persuasive methods. He gestured to the villagers, who stepped forward, their hands reaching for Caroline and Thomas. They were outnumbered, surrounded, with no hope of escape. Suddenly, Thomas stepped in front of Caroline, shielding her with his body. He closed his eyes, his face contorted in concentration. Thomas, what are you doing? Caroline cried, her voice filled with alarm. Thomas didn't answer. He focused his mind, his body trembling with the effort. He reached deep within himself, tapping into the power that the Kronos Society had awakened, the power to see the future, to alter time. He saw a glimpse, a fleeting image of a possible future. He saw Silas, triumphant, holding the locket, his plans fulfilled. He saw a world plunged into chaos, a future ruled by the Kronos Society. He couldn't let that happen. He opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on Silas. I won't let you win, he said, his voice firm, resolute. He focused his energy, channeling his power, creating a temporal distortion, a small, localized rift in time. It was a risky move, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. The air around them shimmered, the cave walls vibrating. The villagers cried out in fear, stumbling backward, their eyes wide with terror. Silas looked startled, his composure momentarily broken. What are you doing?" Thomas didn't answer. He focused his will, expanding the rift, creating a vortex of swirling energy. He was using his own power, the power the Chronos Society had sought to control, against them. The rift grew larger, pulling at the surrounding objects, the rocks, the trees, even the people. Caroline clung to Thomas, her body trembling with fear, but also with a flicker of hope. Silas struggled against the pull of the rift, his face contorted in rage. "You fool!" he shouted. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll destroy us all." Thomas ignored him. He focused his energy, directing the rift, aiming it at Silas and the villagers, pulling them into the vortex. One by one, they were sucked into the swirling chaos, their screams echoing through the cave. Silas was the last to go, his eyes filled with hatred and fear as he disappeared into the temporal abyss. The rift closed, the cave returning to its former stillness. The only sound was the dripping of water and the ragged breathing of Caroline and Thomas. They were alone. They had won. But at what cost? Where Silas and the others were, remained unknown. Chapter 14. The Rendezvous. The silence in the cave was deafening, broken only by their ragged breaths. Caroline looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and trepidation. His face was pale, his body trembling from the exertion of using his temporal abilities. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Thomas nodded weakly. I think so. It takes a lot out of me using that power." Caroline reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of strain around his eyes. "You did it, Thomas. You saved us." He smiled, a faint, weary expression. "We saved each other, Caroline." They stood there for a moment, holding each other, their bodies clinging together in the aftermath of the confrontation. The locket, still clutched in Caroline's hand, felt warm against her skin. "We need to go," Thomas said, his voice regaining its strength. "We need to find a way to use the locket to get back to our own time." They left the cave, emerging into the fading light of the late afternoon. The village was deserted, the houses empty, the streets silent. The villagers, caught in the temporal rift, were gone. They returned to their cottage, their minds racing, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of urgency. They had to figure out how to use the locket, how to activate its temporal compass, before the Chronos Society found them again. Caroline remembered Dr. Finch's journal, the cryptic notes he had made about the locket, about the activation code. She had left the journal in their Washington, D.C. home, a lifetime, a different reality, away. "The code," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "It's in the journal. But we don't have it." Thomas looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Maybe I can remember," he said, his voice hesitant. "The Chronos Society, they showed me things. Glimpses of the future of the past. Maybe I saw the code." He closed his eyes, his face contorted in concentration. He focused his mind, delving into the fragmented memories of his time with the Chronos Society, searching for any clue, any hint of the activation code. Caroline watched him, her heart pounding with hope and anxiety. If he could remember the code, they could use the locket, they could return to their own time, they could stop the Chronos Society's plans. Suddenly, Thomas's eyes snapped open. He looked at Caroline, his gaze filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. I remember something," he said, his voice trembling. "A sequence of numbers, symbols, a combination." He quickly grabbed a piece of charcoal from the fireplace and began to scribble on a scrap of paper, his hand moving rapidly, his mind racing. Caroline watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. He finished writing, his hand shaking. He showed the paper to Caroline. It was a series of numbers and symbols, arranged in a complex pattern. "Is this it?" Caroline asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The activation code?" Thomas nodded. I think so.
It feels right.
They looked at the locket, its silver surface gleaming in the firelight. It was time. Time to return to their own reality, to face the consequences of their actions, to fight for the future they believed in. Caroline carefully entered the code into the locket, her fingers trembling with anticipation. The locket hummed, its surface glowing with a faint, blue light. A small, holographic display appeared above the locket, showing a series of coordinates, dates, and times. It's working, Thomas said, his voice filled with awe. It's showing us temporal rifts openings in time. They searched through the coordinates, looking for a rift that would lead them back to Washington, D.C., to 1920. They found one, a small, unstable rift located near their city, scheduled to open in a few hours. It was their chance. Their only chance. They prepared for their journey, gathering a few essential supplies, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They knew they were stepping into the unknown, facing a dangerous enemy, but they were ready. They were together. As the time of the rift's opening approached, they stood hand in hand, the locket glowing brightly in Caroline's palm. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with love, with determination, with a shared understanding of the risks they were about to take. Ready? Thomas asked, his voice soft but firm. Caroline nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Ready. They stepped into the temporal rift, disappearing into the swirling vortex of time and space. Their destination, Washington, D.C., 1920. Their mission, to stop the Chronos Society, once and for all, but in order to do so, Caroline had to find where she had hidden Dr. Finch's journal. Chapter 15. Flight of the Sparrow. The transition was disorienting, a chaotic jumble of swirling colors and distorted sensations. Caroline clung to Thomas, her eyes tightly shut, her body trembling with the force of the temporal shift. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. They were standing in an alley, the air thick with the familiar sense of coal smoke, gasoline, and damp earth. The sounds of the city, the rumble of cars, the clatter of horses' hooves, the distant shouts of vendors washed over them, a welcome reminder of their own time. Caroline opened her eyes, blinking in the dim light. They were back. Back in Washington, D.C., back in 1920. But the city felt different, subtly altered by their absence, by the knowledge of the Chronos Society's hidden influence. We made it, Thomas said, his voice filled with relief, his hand still tightly gripping hers. But we're not safe yet, Caroline reminded him, her mind racing. We need to find the journal. And we need to find a way to stop the Chronos Society. They emerged from the alley, cautiously scanning the street. It was late evening, the gaslights casting long, eerie shadows. They needed to get to Caroline's home, to retrieve Dr. Finch's journal, but they had to be careful. The Chronos Society could be anywhere, watching their every move. They decided to avoid the main thoroughfares, sticking to the quieter side streets, their steps quick and silent. They moved like shadows, blending into the darkness, their senses alert to any sign of danger. As they approached Caroline's neighborhood, they noticed a heightened sense of unease, a subtle tension in the air. There were more police patrols than usual, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the streets with suspicion. Something's wrong, Thomas whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket, where he had concealed a small pistol he had acquired in 1888. Caroline nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The Chronos Society, they must know we're back. They reached Caroline's house, a stately Victorian mansion that now felt like a gilded cage, a potential trap. The windows were dark, the house silent. Arthur was likely still at his club, unaware of the danger that lurked within his own home. Caroline hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She had a premonition, a chilling sense of foreboding. Wait, Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. I don't like this. It's too quiet. He scanned the surrounding area, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of an ambush. He noticed something, a flicker of movement in the shadows across the street. A figure, lurking in the darkness, watching the house. They're here, Thomas whispered, his hand tightening on his pistol. "They're waiting for us." Caroline felt a surge of fear, but also a renewed determination. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let them take the journal or harm Arthur. "We need a plan," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "We can't just walk in there." They decided to circle around the back of the house, hoping to find an alternative entrance, a way to slip in unnoticed. They moved stealthily, their bodies pressed against the walls, their footsteps silent on the damp grass. They reached the back garden, a small, enclosed space surrounded by a high brick wall. The back door was locked, but there was a small, second-story window that was slightly ajar. "I can climb up there," Thomas said, his eyes assessing the distance. "I can get in through the window." Caroline nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and admiration. "Be careful, Thomas." He smiled, a faint, reassuring expression. "I always am." He began to climb, his movements agile and silent, his body scaling the wall with ease. He reached the window, carefully pushing it open, slipping inside the house. Caroline waited, her breath held tight in her chest, her eyes fixed on the window. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a crash from inside the house, followed by a shout.
"Thomas!"
Caroline cried, her voice filled with alarm. She ran to the back door, pounding on it, her heart racing. "Thomas! What's happening?" There was no answer, only silence. Caroline knew she had to get inside, to help him. She searched for a way to open the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. Then, she remembered the spare key, hidden under a flower pot near the door. She quickly found it, her fingers trembling with urgency. She inserted the key into the lock, turning it with a soft click. She pushed open the door, stepping into the darkness of the house. She was immediately struck by a chilling silence, a sense of emptiness that sent shivers down her spine. "Thomas?" She called out, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. "Where are you?" She moved through the house, her senses alert, her hand clutching the key as a makeshift weapon. She searched the rooms one by one, her heart sinking with each empty space. Then she saw it. In the study, the room where she had first discovered Dr. Finch's journal, a figure lay sprawled on the floor. It was Arthur, unconscious, and there was no sign of the journal, or of Thomas. Chapter 16. The Reckoning. Caroline rushed to Arthur's side, her heart pounding with fear and guilt. She knelt beside him, checking his pulse, her hands trembling. He was alive, but unconscious, a large bruise forming on his forehead. She gently shook him, trying to wake him, her voice filled with desperation. "Arthur! Arthur! Wake up! What happened?" Arthur groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Caroline, his gaze confused and disoriented. "Caroline?" He whispered, his voice hoarse. What happened?" "You were attacked," Caroline said, her voice trembling. "Do you remember who did it?" Arthur struggled to sit up, his hand reaching for his head. I don't know. I heard a noise, then everything went black." Caroline helped him to a chair, her mind racing. Thomas was gone. The journal was gone. And Arthur had been attacked. It was clear that the Chronos Society had been here, that they had taken Thomas and the journal. She had to find them. She had to save Thomas and retrieve the journal before it was too late. "Arthur, I need you to stay here," she said, her voice firm, despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "I need to go. I need to find Thomas." Arthur looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Caroline, what's going on? Who is Thomas?
What are you talking about?"
Caroline hesitated. She couldn't tell him the truth, not all of it. He wouldn't understand. He would think she was mad. It's complicated," she said, choosing her words carefully. "There are dangerous people after something I have. Something that belonged to Dr. Finch." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "Dr. Finch? That eccentric doctor you knew during the war? What does he have to do with this?" "It's a long story, Arthur," Caroline said, her voice pleading. "But I need you to trust me. I need to go. I need to save a friend." Arthur studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. He seemed to sense the urgency in her voice, the desperation in her eyes. "Be careful, Caroline," he said, his voice filled with a quiet concern. "Please be careful." Caroline nodded, her heart aching with guilt and fear. She kissed him gently on the forehead, then turned and left the house, disappearing into the night. She had no plan, no destination, only a burning determination to find Thomas, to rescue him from the clutches of the Kronos Society. She walked the streets, her mind racing, her senses alert to any sign of movement, any hint of her enemies. She felt lost, alone, with no one to turn to. Then, she remembered Mrs. Davies, Dr. Finch's loyal housekeeper. She had helped her before. Perhaps she could help her again. Caroline made her way to Georgetown, to Dr. Finch's former residence, her steps quick and purposeful. She reached the townhouse, its familiar facade a beacon of hope in the darkness. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited, her breath held tight, her eyes scanning the street. The door opened, and Mrs. Davies stood before her, her face etched with worry. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're back. But you're in danger." "I know," Caroline said, her voice urgent. "They took Thomas. They took the journal. I need your help." Mrs. Davies ushered her inside, her movements quick and decisive. She led her to the study, the room where Caroline had first discovered the locket, the room that held the secrets of Dr. Finch's research. "I feared this," Mrs. Davies said, her voice trembling. "The Kronos Society, they are relentless." "We have to find them," Caroline said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to save Thomas." Mrs. Davies nodded. "There is one place, a place where they might be. A place where Dr. Finch conducted his most secret experiments." She reached into a hidden compartment in the desk, pulling out a small, leather-bound book. It was another journal, smaller than the one Caroline had found before, its pages filled with Dr. Finch's cryptic notes. This is the key," Mrs. Davies said, her voice hushed. "It contains the location of Dr. Finch's hidden laboratory, a place where he manipulated time." Caroline took the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather. It was their last hope, their only chance to find Thomas, to stop the Kronos Society, to save the future. It was also their last hope of setting things right. The laboratory, hidden beneath the city, awaited. Chapter 17. Beyond the Trenches. The second journal was even more cryptic than the first, filled with complex equations, scientific diagrams, and philosophical musings on the nature of time. Caroline and Mrs. Davies spent hours poring over the entries, deciphering Dr. Finch's intricate code, trying to pinpoint the location of his hidden laboratory. The address, when they finally cracked the code, led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, near the Potomac River. It seemed an unlikely location for a cutting-edge scientific facility, but Caroline knew that Dr. Finch had always been a master of disguise, a man who preferred to operate in the shadows. They arrived at the warehouse under the cover of darkness, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The building was large and dilapidated, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in graffiti. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. "This is it?" Caroline asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes scanning the desolate surroundings. Mrs. Davies nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. "According to the journal, yes. The entrance is hidden." They searched the perimeter of the warehouse, their hands brushing against the rough brick walls, their eyes searching for any sign of a hidden door, a secret passage. Finally, Caroline found it. A small, almost imperceptible seam in the wall, concealed behind a loose brick. She pushed on the brick, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Let's go." They entered the passageway, Mrs. Davies leading the way with a small, battery-powered lantern. The air inside was cool and damp, the silence broken only by the dripping of water and their own hushed footsteps. The passageway led them down a long, winding staircase, deep into the earth. The walls were lined with strange, metallic panels, and the air hummed with a faint, almost imperceptible energy. They reached the bottom of the staircase and found themselves in a large, circular chamber. The room was filled with strange, futuristic machinery, glowing consoles, and intricate devices that Caroline couldn't even begin to comprehend. It was like stepping into a different world, a world of advanced technology and temporal manipulation. Dr. Finch's laboratory, Mrs. Davies whispered, her voice filled with awe. He built this in secret, a place where he could experiment with time. Caroline's gaze swept across the room, her mind racing. This was where the Chronos Society had been conducting their experiments, where they had altered Thomas, where they were planning to reshape the future. And then she saw him. Thomas was strapped to a large, metallic chair in the center of the room, his body surrounded by a web of wires and sensors. He looked pale, weakened, but his eyes were open, and they were fixed on Caroline.
Caroline,
He called out, his voice hoarse, but filled with relief. You're here. Caroline ran towards him, her heart pounding with joy and fear. Thomas, are you all right? I think so, he said, his voice strained. But they've been experimenting on me, trying to control my powers. Before Caroline could reach him, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Silas, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and triumph. Welcome, Mrs. Mitchell, he said, his voice smooth and menacing. I see you found our little hideaway. He held the original journal, and on his hand was the locket. Caroline faced him. She had to end this charade, once and for all. Chapter 18. A Love Forged in Fire. Let him go, Silas, Caroline demanded, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. She stood between him and Thomas, a protective barrier against the man who threatened to destroy everything she held dear. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the laboratory. I'm afraid that's not possible, Mrs. Mitchell. Major Ellison is far too valuable to us. He gestured towards the complex machinery surrounding Thomas. We've been enhancing his abilities, making him even more powerful. You're turning him into a weapon, Caroline spat, her voice filled with disgust. A tool for your twisted ambitions. Silas smiled, a chilling, predatory expression.
precisely.
With Major Ellison's power, we can control time itself. We can reshape the future, create a new world order. You're insane, Caroline said, her eyes blazing with anger. You can't control time. It's not yours to manipulate. Silas raised an eyebrow, his gaze condescending. Such naivete, Mrs. Mitchell. You underestimate our power, our knowledge. He held up the locket, its silver surface gleaming in the dim light. With this device and Major Ellison's amplified abilities, we can rewrite history itself. Caroline felt a surge of desperation. She had to stop him. She had to save Thomas and prevent the catastrophic future that Silas envisioned.
But how?
She was unarmed, outnumbered, facing a man who wielded the power of time itself. She looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. He was struggling against his restraints, his body straining against the metal straps that held him captive. Caroline the machine, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The control panel, destroy it. Caroline's eyes darted to the control panel, a complex array of buttons, switches, and dials. It was the heart of the Chronos Society's operation, the key to controlling Thomas's powers, to manipulating time. If she could destroy it, she could disrupt their plans, free Thomas, and perhaps even reverse the temporal damage they had already inflicted. But Silas stood between her and the control panel, his eyes narrowed, his hand hovering over the locket. He was anticipating her move, ready to counter any attempt she made to interfere. She needed a distraction, a way to divert his attention, to create an opening. She looked at Mrs. Davies, the elderly housekeeper standing silently in the shadows, her face etched with fear and determination. Mrs. Davies, Caroline said, her voice low and urgent. Did the emergency shut off? Do you know where it is? Mrs. Davies nodded, her eyes widening in understanding. Yes, Dr. Finch showed me. It's behind the main console. Caroline turned back to Silas, her mind racing. She had to create a diversion, a moment of chaos that would allow Mrs. Davies to reach the emergency shutoff. "You won't win, Silas," she said, her voice defiant. "You can't control the future. It belongs to all of us." She lunged forward, not towards the control panel, but towards Silas himself, her hands outstretched, her eyes blazing with anger. Silas reacted instantly, raising the locket, his fingers pressing the activation button. A wave of temporal energy surged through the room, knocking Caroline off her feet, sending her sprawling across the floor. But it was enough. The distraction had worked. Mrs. Davies, taking advantage of the chaos, slipped past Silas, her movements surprisingly quick and agile for her age. She reached the main console, her hands searching for the emergency shut-off switch. Silas, realizing his mistake, turned to stop her, but it was too late. Mrs. Davies found the switch, a large, red lever hidden beneath the console. She pulled it down, with all her strength. The laboratory plunged into darkness, the machinery whirring and sparking, then falling silent. The temporal energy dissipated, the room returning to its normal state. Thomas, freed from the machine's control, ripped himself free from his restraints, his body surging with adrenaline. Silas, enraged, turned to face Caroline, his eyes blazing with fury. He no longer had the upper hand. The room was filled with a deafening silence. Caroline stood between the two men, a silent promise that she would not let Silas hurt Thomas again. Chapter 19. The Truth Unveiled. "You," Silas sputtered, his voice choked with rage, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He lunged at Caroline, his hands outstretched, his fingers clawing at the air. But Thomas was faster. He intercepted Silas, tackling him to the ground, his body shielding Caroline from the attack. They grappled on the floor, a tangle of limbs and desperate struggles, the air filled with the sounds of grunts and curses. Caroline scrambled to her feet, her eyes searching for a weapon, anything she could use to help Thomas. She spotted a heavy metal wrench lying near the disabled machinery. She grabbed it, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. Thomas and Silas were locked in a brutal struggle, their bodies straining against each other, their faces inches apart. Silas, despite his age, was surprisingly strong, his movements fueled by a desperate, fanatical energy. "You can't stop us, Major," Silas hissed, his voice filled with venom. "The future is ours. We will reshape the world." "No," Thomas growled, his voice strained. "You won't. I won't let you." He managed to pin Silas's arms, his grip tightening, his muscles straining with the effort. But Silas was still struggling, his eyes blazing with hatred. Caroline saw her chance. She raised the wrench, her hands trembling, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination.
"Silas,
"Stop," she shouted, her voice echoing through the silent laboratory. Silas turned his head, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Caroline standing over him, the wrench poised to strike. But before Caroline could bring the wrench down, another voice rang out, a voice filled with authority and a hint of sadness. "Enough." Everyone froze. Standing in the doorway of the laboratory, silhouetted against the faint light of the passageway, was Dr. Alistair Finch. He was older, his hair completely white, his face lined with wrinkles, but his eyes still held that familiar spark of intelligence and eccentricity. He was alive, and he was holding a small, silver device, similar to the one Silas had used, but more advanced, more powerful. "Doctor?" Mrs. Davies whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "But you are dead, not dead, my dear Mrs. Davies," Dr. Finch said, his voice calm and measured. "Merely elsewhen." He stepped into the laboratory, his gaze sweeping across the scene, Thomas and Silas struggling on the floor, Caroline standing over them with the wrench, Mrs. Davies staring at him in shock. "I see my little experiment has gotten out of hand," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of regret. "Experiment?" Caroline said, her voice filled with confusion.
what are you talking about?"
Dr. Finch sighed, his gaze shifting to Caroline. "It's a long story, Mrs. Mitchell. A story that began long before you were born. He explained, his voice echoing through the silent laboratory, how he had discovered the principles of temporal mechanics, how he had built the laboratory, how he had formed the Chronos Society. It was meant to be a force for good, he said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. A way to prevent wars, to alleviate suffering, to guide humanity towards a better future. But his idealism had been corrupted, his vision twisted by the lure of power. The Chronos Society had become a tool for control, a means of imposing their will on the world. Silas, Dr. Finch said, his gaze shifting to the man still struggling beneath Thomas. He was my protege, my most promising student, but he became obsessed with power. He wanted to reshape the world in his own image. Silas, hearing his name, spat on the floor. You were weak, old man, he snarled. You lacked the vision, the courage, to seize our destiny. Dr. Finch ignored him, his gaze fixed on Caroline. I knew I had to stop him, he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. I had to find someone who could resist the temptation of power, someone who could use the temporal compass for good. He had chosen Caroline. He had orchestrated the events, the unburned letter, the cryptic messages, the hidden clues, all designed to lead her to the truth, to prepare her for the final confrontation. You used me? Caroline said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and betrayal. I guided you, Dr. Finch corrected, his voice gentle. I gave you the tools, the knowledge, to make your own choices, to choose your own destiny. He raised the silver device in his hand. This is the final key, he said. It can reset the timeline, erase the damage that Silas has done. But it can only be used once. And it requires a sacrifice. Caroline looked at Thomas, at Silas, at the complex machinery surrounding them. She understood. The sacrifice was Silas. His temporal energy, his connection to the Chronos Society, had to be severed, erased from the timeline. It was a terrible choice, a moral dilemma that weighed heavily on her soul. But she knew what she had to do. She looked at Dr. Finch, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. Do it, she said, her voice firm. End this.
Now.
Dr. Finch nodded. He stepped forward, aiming the device at Silas. Silas, realizing his fate, screamed, his voice filled with terror and rage. But it was too late. Dr. Finch activated the device. A blinding flash of light filled the laboratory, followed by a deafening silence. Silas was gone, erased from existence. The Chronos Society was no more. Chapter 20. A New Dawn. The laboratory was silent, the air thick with the scent of ozone and the lingering echoes of the temporal shift. Caroline stood beside Thomas, his arm around her, their bodies trembling from the ordeal. Mrs. Davies stood nearby, her face pale but resolute, her gaze fixed on Dr. Finch. Dr. Finch lowered the device, his hand shaking slightly. He looked older, wearier, the weight of his actions etched on his face. It is done, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The timeline has been reset. Silas, the Chronos Society, they never existed. Caroline felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of closure that eased the tension in her muscles. But it was a bittersweet victory. The scars of the past, the memories of the struggle, would remain. What about us? Thomas asked, his voice hesitant, his eyes searching Dr. Finch's face. Our memories, our experiences, Dr. Finch smiled, a faint, sad expression. You will remember, he said. You have been touched by time. Your experiences are etched on your souls. But the world around you, it will be different. A world without the Chronos Society, a world where the future is unwritten. Caroline looked at Thomas, their eyes meeting, their hands interlacing. They had been through so much, faced so many dangers, but their love had endured, strengthened by the fires of adversity. What will you do now, Doctor? Mrs. Davies asked, her voice filled with a quiet concern. Dr. Finch sighed, his gaze sweeping across the silent laboratory. I will dismantle this place, he said. Destroy the technology. Erase all traces of my mistakes. He looked at Caroline and Thomas, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. You have a chance to build a better future. A future free from the shadows of the past. He handed Caroline the silver device, the one he had used to erase Silas.
This is yours now, he said.
Use it wisely. Protect the timeline. Guard against those who would seek to control it. Caroline took the device, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal. It felt heavy in her hand, filled with the weight of responsibility, the burden of knowledge. They left the laboratory, stepping back into the passageway, leaving behind the remnants of Dr. Finch's ambition, the echoes of the Kronos Society's twisted dreams. They emerged from the warehouse into the cool night air, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The world felt different, lighter, the oppressive weight of the Kronos Society lifted from their shoulders. They returned to Caroline's home, their steps slow and measured, their minds filled with the enormity of what they had experienced. Arthur was still there, asleep on the sofa, his face pale and drawn. Caroline gently woke him, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. She couldn't tell him the whole truth, not yet, but she reassured him, her touch gentle, her voice filled with love.
It's all right, Arthur, she said.
It's over. Everything is all right. Arthur looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion and concern, but he seemed to sense the sincerity in her voice, the depth of her emotions. He trusted her. In the days that followed, Caroline and Thomas began to rebuild their lives, their bond strengthened by the shared trauma, the shared victory. They had a second chance, a new beginning, a future free from the shadows of the Kronos Society. They destroyed Dr. Finch's second journal, erasing all traces of his temporal research, ensuring that the knowledge would never fall into the wrong hands. They kept the silver device, the temporal reset key, hidden away, a constant reminder of their responsibility, their duty to protect the timeline. Caroline returned to her life, to her marriage with Arthur, but she was changed. The war, the Kronos Society, Thomas, they had all left their mark. She was stronger, more resilient, more aware of the fragility of time, the importance of living each moment to the fullest. She and Thomas remained close, their bond unbreakable, their love a silent, enduring flame. They met in secret, sharing their memories, their hopes, their fears. They were bound together by a shared past, a shared future, a love that had transcended time itself. The world moved on, oblivious to the hidden struggles, the secret battles that had been fought to protect it. The scars of the past faded, the memories blurred, but the love between Caroline and Thomas remained, a beacon of hope in a world that was constantly changing, constantly evolving. A love that had survived, that was forged, in the very fires of the impossible itself. They had cheated death and time, and they were ready for anything. Epilogue. Years passed, turning into decades. The world changed, evolving in ways that Caroline and Thomas could have scarcely imagined back in 1920. Wars came and went, technologies advanced, societies transformed. But their love remained, a constant, unwavering force in their lives. Arthur, ever the kind and understanding husband, eventually passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving Caroline a widow, but not alone. She had Thomas, her soulmate, her confidant, the man who had shared her extraordinary journey through time. They never spoke of the Kronos Society, of Dr. Finch, of the temporal rift. It was a secret they guarded closely, a burden they carried together, a memory that bound them together in a way that no one else could understand. The silver device, the temporal reset key, remained hidden, a silent testament to their past, a safeguard for the future. They never used it, never even considered it, trusting that the timeline was now on its natural course, free from the interference of those who would seek to control it. Caroline and Thomas lived long, full lives, their love story a quiet, enduring epic, a testament to the power of human connection, the resilience of the human spirit. They watched their children, and then their grandchildren, grow and thrive, embracing the future with a hope and optimism that they had earned through their struggles. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their small cottage, overlooking a peaceful, sun-drenched valley, Caroline turned to Thomas, her eyes filled with a familiar warmth, a love that had spanned decades and dimensions. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice soft, her hand reaching for his. "Our journey, the choices we made," Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand clasping hers tightly. "Never," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "Not for a moment. It led me to you. And that's all that matters." Caroline leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace, of contentment. They had faced the impossible, conquered their fears, and emerged victorious, their love a beacon of hope in a world that was constantly changing, constantly evolving. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the valley, they sat in silence, their hands interlaced, their hearts beating as one. They had lived a life beyond the trenches, beyond the boundaries of time, a life forged in fire, tempered by adversity, and illuminated by a love that would endure for eternity. Their story, their secret, would remain with them, a testament to the extraordinary power of human connection, the enduring strength of the human heart. They had found each other, and they were not going to waste a single second of what they had left. It was a story of courage and trust and second chances. The end.